Welcome back, everyone, to another Explainer. Today, we're widening our view of the Renaissance. We're stepping outside the familiar streets of Florence to discover a much wider, far more complex era. You see, this was a time of breathtaking art, absolutely. But it was equally an era of incredibly dangerous politics and revolutionary discoveries that, fascinatingly, were often just never shared with the world. As we're going to see today, the Renaissance was not just some simple, steady march toward progress. It was messy, it was volatile, and honestly, it was absolutely captivating.
So, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Milan and the Sforzas. 2. Leonardo, the life. 3. Leonardo, scientist and inventor. 4. Tuscany and Umbria. And finally, 5. A wider, complex Renaissance. Let's jump right in.
Chapter 1, Milan and the Sforzas.
To really understand Milan, you have to understand its political roller coaster. Initially, you had the Visconti family, who built this incredible power through war, diplomacy, and just ruthless control. But as dynasties falter, power shifted to the condottieri. These were professional mercenary commanders who led hired troops. One of the greatest of these was Francesco Sforza. When the Visconti line ended, Milan actually tried to become a republic for a bit, called the Ambrosian Republic. But Francesco Sforza, who they hired to defend it, basically just took the city for himself in 1450 and founded a brand new dynasty. Fast forward a few decades, and his son Lodovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, builds this dazzling, super wealthy court. We're talking funded canals, universities, hospitals, and incredible art patronage. But then, Lodovico made a fatal political miscalculation. He invited King Charles VIII of France into Italy to help with a local dispute. This French intervention completely opened the floodgates to foreign invasions, which ultimately led to Milan's fall and Lodovico's own imprisonment.
Now this brings us to the central dilemma of Renaissance princely government. It's a classic double-edged sword. On one hand, a despot could act incredibly fast. Having concentrated authority meant they could bypass all that messy factional fighting, organize taxes efficiently, and fund absolute genius. The court was essentially a machine for generating prestige. But on the other hand, that exact same concentrated authority made the entire state dangerously fragile. Milan was utterly dependent on one single family. A child heir, a sudden assassination, or literally just one terrible diplomatic mistake, like, inviting in the French army, could doom the entire state overnight.
So, I want you to keep this question in mind. How could the exact same political system that created a court wealthy and vibrant enough to attract someone like Leonardo da Vinci be the very thing that caused Milan's complete collapse? It really highlights that the Renaissance was not a simple upward climb. It was a delicate balance right on a knife's edge.
Chapter 2. Leonardo, the life.
If you trace Leonardo's life, you see this constant, restless movement, dictated by shifting wars and changing patrons. He started off in Florence, training in Verrocchio's workshop, which was this brilliant interdisciplinary space where he learned painting, metalwork, and engineering. But, facing some pretty stiff competition in Florence, he moved to Milan. And here's a fun fact. When Leonardo pitched himself to Lodovico Sforza, he wrote a letter listing his skills, and he listed military engineering, bridges, and weapons first. He only mentioned painting at the very end. He knew exactly what a Renaissance prince needed. But when the French conquered Milan, Leonardo had to pack up and move again. Back to Florence to paint the Mona Lisa, then to central Italy to design military maps for the ruthless Cesare Borgia, back to Milan again, then Rome, until finally spending his last years in France under King Francis I. His entire geographic journey maps directly onto Italy's political instability.
And his life perfectly illustrates this cognitive loop that really defined his mind. We can call it the Leonardo pattern. It goes like this. He starts with a question. To answer it, he observes nature intensely. Then, he conducts an experiment. But that experiment almost always leads to a much bigger question, which pulls his attention in a totally new direction. And finally, because of his shifting interests, or maybe because a war broke out and his patron lost power, the project ends in interruption or incompletion.
Which brings us to the ultimate dilemma of his legacy. On one hand, his refusal to be just a painter was the exact source of his greatness. He studied anatomy, light, and mechanics to make his paintings absolutely perfect. But on the flip side, that same relentless curiosity was his greatest obstacle. He left countless works unfinished. Take the massive bronze Forza horse, which ended up getting melted down for cannons. Or consider the Last Supper. Instead of using traditional, reliable wet fresco, he experimented with a totally new technique on dry plaster just so he could take his time. The result? Well, it's a psychological masterpiece, but it began decaying almost as soon as he finished it. The same thing happened with the Battle of Anghiari, ruined by another experimental technique.
So the crucial point we have to ask is this. Was his endless curiosity the fuel for his genius or the greatest obstacle to his success? His brilliance naturally pulled him from art into geology, mechanics, and anatomy, which basically meant a single lifetime simply wasn't enough to finish what he started.
Chapter 3. Leonardo, Scientist and Inventor. For Leonardo, drawing wasn't just about making pretty pictures. Drawing was quite literally his primary way of thinking. A single line could figure out how a muscle attached to a bone, how water swirled around a rock, or how a gear transferred force. His notebooks are just packed with incredible studies of the heart, fossils, optics, and even human flight. But we need to make an important historical distinction here. Leonardo imagined extraordinary things, yes, but he did not actually invent every modern machine attributed to him. Many of his designs could never have worked with the materials available at the time. Some of his scientific conclusions were just flat out wrong, and crucially, these records were totally chaotic and he never published them.
But notice how his mind built a really systematic approach to knowledge. He developed this remarkable, step-by-step scientific method. He would observe nature, draw it to understand its mechanics, compare it to other phenomena, ask new questions, test his theories, and then revise his understanding. For the 15th century, this empirical, observation-based system was truly ahead of its time.
But this creates another historical tension for us. Is he a founder of modern science? Well, he certainly had the method and the vision, but because he didn't systematically publish his findings, and because he never created a scientific school of students to carry on his work, his discoveries were entirely isolated. He was a once-in-a-generation observer for sure, but his knowledge remained mostly private, locked away in his personal notebooks for centuries.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to ponder. Does knowledge become historically powerful only when it is communicated and shared? Is discovering a truth enough on its own, or does that knowledge effectively die in a notebook if it isn't tested, built upon, and actually used by society?
Chapter 4. Tuscany and Umbria.
We are leaving Leonardo's notebooks behind now to look at how different regions were developing entirely different visual languages. The Renaissance didn't just have one single style. Let's look at a major contrast. Take Piero della Francesca. His core focus was all about mathematics, strict perspective, and geometry. The visual mood he created was one of incredible stillness, order, very controlled light, and a sort of monumental calm. Now compare that to Luca Signorelli. Signorelli was absolutely obsessed with anatomy, violent movement, and heavily muscular bodies. His frescoes are packed with physical drama, fear, and judgment. In fact, Signorelli's intense focus on dramatic, twisting bodies paved the way directly for Michelangelo's later masterpieces. So you have two artists in the exact same era speaking completely different visual languages.
And it wasn't just about the biggest, most powerful cities either. Take Siena. By this time, Siena had lost a lot of its political power and importance, but artists there, like Sodoma, were still producing incredible work. This adds such a fascinating layer to the era. Political decline did not automatically mean cultural decline. Rich visual traditions could still thrive even as a city's power faded on the map.
Chapter 5. A wider, complex Renaissance. Now, let's bring all these threads together. If there is one thing you take away from this explainer, it's that the Renaissance was a deeply fragmented era. It was not some neat, uniform march toward enlightenment. Dazzling culture flourished right alongside brutal, terrifying political violence. Brilliant scientific discoveries were made, only to be totally lost in unshared notebooks. Despots created stable, wealthy environments that could, and frequently did, collapse overnight due to a single bad alliance. And progress was constantly being interrupted by foreign invasions, like the French in Milan, and tragic dynastic flaws.
The great historian Jacob Burckhardt captured this dynamic perfectly. He wrote, "As despotisms rise, grow, and are consolidated, so grows in their midst the hidden element which must produce their dissolution and ruin." Think about that. The very systems that funded the Renaissance contain the seeds of their own destruction. The exact same wealth that bought the art also bought the mercenaries that tore those cities apart. Which leaves us here. Was the Renaissance a perfect march of progress, or was it a chaotic, messy era of unshared discoveries, competing art styles, and fundamentally unstable princes? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helps you see this brilliant, sometimes dangerous period in a whole new light. Keep questioning, keep observing, and I'll leave you to ponder the true, messy nature of historical progress.